Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research of esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to take your leadership to the next level. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very privileged to have Alisa Cohn, who was named the top startup coach in the world by the Thinkers 50 and Marshall Goldsmith, and the #1 global guru for startups in 2021. She is a sought after speaker, and she's been named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers, and also as a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review and Forbes. She can also add now best-selling author to her long list of accomplishments with her book From Startup to Grown Up, which unpacks and provides insights and tools for the journey that leaders, founders, and really all leaders can take and must go through as they scale their leadership. Welcome to the podcast, Alisa.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here, Charles.
Thank you. I love, before we dive into this great book, just for you to kind of unpack a little bit of your personal and professional journey and what led you to becoming kind of concentrated around startup companies and helping them and coaching them.
Well, I became a coach first and foremost because I wanted to make a difference. So I was in the nonprofit world. I worked with educational institutions and exchange students, and then I was a CPA and I was a management consultant, all those things. But when I met a coach, I like violins played. I thought like, oh, that's what I want to do because I could just really see the impact that she could have on other people. So that was really important to me. So over time, I should also mention that before I became a coach, I was an executive in the startup world myself. I was the CFO of one startup, the head of strategy of another startup. And when that all imploded, that's when I became a coach. I'd already gotten coach training and I'd already kind of gone down the path of what it would take to be a coach. And I think I rediscovered my love of the startup world when I moved to New York about 14 years ago, because we were just then building this ecosystem inside of New York for startups. And so I love to be part of something. I'm a builder myself. I love to be part of building an ecosystem and a community. And that led me back into startups. And I started working with a number of prominent startups in New York, and that kind of all snowballed from there.
No, that's great. A great journey. And your passion really shows through with all your expertise in this area. So I loved it to dive into this book, and I love how it's organized, right? Because if you can't manage yourself, well, you shouldn't be managing others, and you really shouldn't be managing an organization. So let's start with the part about managing yourself. And you list in that first chapter that you really must fall in love and really self-examine and become self-aware with that person in the mirror. And you talk about how you need to have this kind of radical self-examination. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? Because I think that's so critical for leaders to really understand their biases, their assumptions they may be holding, the stuff that's holding them back that they may not even be aware of.
Yeah, it's so true, Charles. What you just said is so accurate, right? We can talk about the business all day long, but if the issues are with the people in the business, that's what we have to really focus on, your management of them. But really, what's in the way of you managing them? Because there are many limitations, baggage, strengths, blind spots that we have to really unpack ourselves. So that's why I start with managing you. And I guess I would just say, to say the obvious, we all have biases. We all have baggage. We all have our natural strengths and skills, our natural swings, and we all have the things that we're not so great at or they're little problems for us. You have to know what those are so that you don't get set off and triggered by mistake when something shows up, and also so that you can hire around them. Because ultimately, if you are not the most organized person, you want organized people around you. If you're not the most vocal person, you've got to learn to, as a CEO and any leader, you've got to learn to be more vocal. However, you also need to hire people around you who'll remind you and catalyze that and also be vocal for you. So knowing kind of who you are and what you're made up of is a starting point for all of that.
Now, that's a great insight that you just shared as well, that I think a lot of leaders need to hear this again and just be reinforced that once you know yourself better, you now know who you need to hire, right? So that can balance you, that can complement some of your strengths. And I like how you state in the book, this act of reflection really needs to become a reflex. So once you're good at it, it needs to be that.
Yeah, you need to do it over and over again. And when something happens in an organization, this is true for startups and large companies, but especially for startups, it's like you're going to react. That's normal. And you might react by burrowing into your cube or whatever it is and to your computer and doing more research when really what's needed is action. Or you might react with action And really what is needed is more research. So you're sort of, the art of reflection has to become reflex so that you immediately go to what's going on around here. And that will help decide if what action you need to take.
Oh, that's great. And you categorize leadership styles with 6 different questions, which I love these questions because I think they deal with a lot of what leaders are struggling with, especially new leaders. Let's just try to unpack some of these because we're not going to have time to talk about each one of these. But one thing I know with new leaders, with leaders that are moving up in their roles, is how to deal with conflict, right? And I think with all of these, you give 2 extremes, right? And it's not good to be on either extreme. You have to find that right balance. But I love how you state that when leaders deal with conflicts, they normally have 2 speeds, and that's silence or violence. How does a leader get around that and have a more balanced approach? Because I would argue that a lot of leaders do not like conflict. Yet now they're in a position where they have to deal with it. They can't cower or hide behind someone else. It's now their job to deal with this person, and they need to be more proactive in their approach, right?
100%. And I agree with you that most leaders, and in fact, most people don't like dealing with conflict. So the silence or violence tends to be, I'm not going to mention anything. I'm not going to mention anything. I'm not going to say anything. I can't believe you did that. What's wrong with you? Right. That's the violence part. And everyone has to realize that there is a third way, that you can address your concerns with clarity and candor, and also with compassion. You can be direct and also diplomatic. You have to always recognize there's a person over there, a person who woke up this morning trying to do a good job, planning to do a good job, a person with all the hopes and dreams and problems and concerns of a person. So you want to be respectful and compassionate, diplomatic. At the same time, if it's not going well, or if there's something that needs to change, there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, you need to. It's your job to say, hey, this thing is not going well. And what I need you to do is to start making these changes. I need you to interact with your peers a lot more and collaborate a lot more. I need you to manage your team more directly. I need you to keep me in the loop more often. I need you to kind of work harder and go off and do the research before you come and talk to me, whatever that is. But all of that can be discussed and delivered without a lot of the bite and the heat that I think some people associate with conflict.
I love that, the bite and the heat. And I love your book about how it gives you scripts. A lot of managers, even seasoned managers, need scripts because in difficult situations, tough conversations, conflict, they trip over themselves or they make the matters worse, right? Because they really don't know what they want or are saying or trying to couch it in terms where it softens it too much and people really don't get that what they're trying to convey. So is there an approach or a script that you could help leaders with when it's conflict, when someone on the other side is really aggressive and in your face? How do you help a leader say, not just kind of shut down, right? But say it in such a way that the other person gets the message, but it doesn't create an escalating violence of just words throwing back and forth, right, between the two.
Yeah, that's kind of an advanced move, Charles. So you're giving me a lot. Yeah.
You are the person to ask about that. So I want to.
So, yeah. So let me say this. First of all, you as a leader, it's really how that's back to managing yourself. Let's start with you. Let's start with you intending to have a good day. What do you do in the morning to make sure you're going to have a good day? Your daily routine, making sure that you take time to have spaciousness in your morning, working out, probably meditating, knowing what you're going to get done today. Whatever it is going to make you feel like I'm in a good space. My North Star is aligned. Okay. Then you approach somebody and you might know, oh, we're about to have a difficult conversation, or it might just spring up like, oh, wait, what happened here? I like to tell all my leaders. So again, it starts with you. I like to tell all my leaders, it's like the thunderstorm, thunder, 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 thunder. It's not going to hurt you and it's going to be over. And so you want to have enough perspective with somebody who is having, let's say, a really heated moment with you. And then only then, and I would also say maybe get curious right there and then, like, this person is overreacting. I wonder why. Or, I can understand why. This is a very difficult thing we're talking about. I can understand why this person is overreacting. So all of that happens before you say anything, right? But then once you're curious, once you recognize it was just a thunderstorm, it's not going to hurt you and it's going to be over, you can then address this person, which would be like, listen, I don't want to overly upset you. And there's some serious things we absolutely need to talk about. We need to talk about them either today, or we can talk about them tomorrow or the next day, but one way or the other, absolutely these things we have to talk about. And ultimately, I want for the good of you and the company and all of our teammates. So we need to come to a decision and to a resolution that's going to take all of that into account. And I mean, those are, it depends on the situation, right?
Right.
But those are some of the words that you can use. But I think more fundamentally, that's how you get your mind and your heart set so you don't get bowled over by an overreaction or some particularly heated conflict. Last thing, Charles, I do want to say one more thing. You might want to examine why you're so squeamish about conflict, right? Like people sometimes think everything is conflict, and also just having a direct conversation like, I need you to come to the meeting on time. That feels like conflict to people. It's not conflict. But even if it is, wow, I need you to change your ways about doing this. You might want to really get curious about your own reaction and why you're having such trouble with that. Because again, it's about getting yourself straight before you can then deal with other people.
Well, that's some great insight to share. And really, you're right. It's about self-examining, being more reflective, not reactionary, and knowing and trying to empathize with that individual, right? As you're, or when you're going to have that conversation. So we talked about dealing with conflict. That's one of the questions. The other one we kind of touched upon too, because that goes hand in hand with giving feedback, especially having difficult conversations. The third one I'd like to just focus on a little bit because everyone's under more and more stress, right? And that kind of also connects here as well, because you have that shut down, work harder mode on one extreme, but at some point people stop shutting down and working harder. They just start to explode or they snap, right? So how do you help leaders check down or shut down or try their best not to lash out? I would assume it's being more reflective, not so reactionary, but that's you you always see that leader, right? Where the kettle's about ready to just blow the top off of,
Yeah.
and they just can't control it. So the next person that walks into their office is just going to get it.
Yeah. When you're, I think a lot about followers privilege. If you're an individual contributor and you have sometimes, let's say you're highly strung and someone comes and talks to you and you kind of explode at them, whatever, you're an individual contributor. Probably shouldn't do that. But like, it doesn't ultimately really hurt the company all that much. When you're a leader and you're the CEO and you're the founder and any of the combination thereof, it really matters what you do. People are watching what you do. So you have to first accept that you've taken on this mantle of leadership. And so your expressions are no longer your own. Your reactions are no longer your own. So like, just make peace with that. And the second thing is when you feel yourself super tightly strung and you're super tightly wound and you're about to explode, how about this? Before that person comes in, go for a walk or just calm yourself down to recognize, all right, we're not saving babies here. Even if you are saving babies, you've got to take the pressure off. And it's not because it's not serious what you're doing. It's because that sort of overly important and overly making stakes and overly pressurizing yourself and others turns out to be counterproductive. So you've got to catch, that's back to reflection. You've got to catch yourself before you explode and find tools, which might be count to 10. It might be a quick meditation. It might be walk around the block. Maybe you're hungry. Go eat something. Right. And do all those things, not because they're like nice to do and not because the coach tells you to do them, because your impact as a leader is massive and it's expensive when you make those kinds of mistakes.
Can agree with you more. And I think senior leaders really forget that when they make a suggestion, it's taken as an order. So they
100%.
have to understand that. And then also, they're not going to get honest feedback usually from their people that are underneath them. So 360 feedback could be essential because you might have a certain intention, but that behavior is not coming across in others. And I love how you have those standard questions that you normally ask for those 360 feedback. But I love the last question you ask, because I think that's so important that if someone says, I want my leader to be more collaborative, well, what does that mean? Tell me, tell me about observable behaviors that I could then give that person to say, okay, here's what they mean by that, which I think hits the nail on the head.
Well, thank you for saying that. I try to be very specific because there are so many words we know how collaborative and strategic and many, even communicative. Well, what does that really mean? Because that means something different for everybody. And so it's very helpful to get a roadmap about what specific behavioral suggestions do you have for this leader? And you can frame them in the sense of start doing, stop doing, continue doing. And I also like to say, if a video recorder were going to capture what's going on, What would that video show when we rolled the tape? But I also want to go back to the idea that people don't give leaders feedback. So I was working with a CFO one time of a very large company, and I got feedback for her, and there were some very difficult things that basically she berated people when she was in a bad mood, something like that. And she went to the people and said, I understand that I berate people, and I shouldn't, and I know that I don't, so I'm really sorry. And they all said, that's okay. That's okay. And she came back to me and said, oh, they forgave me. They said it was okay. Or they didn't. Some of them said it's not really a big deal. Alisa, it's not really a big deal. They told me it's not a big deal. I'm like, well, when I spoke to them, it seemed like a pretty big deal. Right. So it's like so interesting how even that leader who then, went to the trouble, to her credit, of going back to people and following up, she got a very underestimated experience of what it was like for them when they got berated on the other side of her.
It just means you have to just have trust and a strong connection with your coach, because you're right. Because your employees are not going to tell you how they really feel. I mean, that just wouldn't be the right thing to do. Another buzzword these days is authenticity. Everyone's saying be a more authentic leader. I love how you kind of turn it on your head and say, let's not talk about authenticity. Let's talk about humanity. Can you kind of unpack that for me, the difference?
Yeah, I think a buzzword is authenticity, right? And so what I sort of think, and another buzzword, and I am the biggest emotional person there is in the world, but another sort of buzz thing is that, like, crying in the workplace is okay. By the way, crying in the workplace is at times okay. Tearing up and getting emotional, especially when things are serious and you're, like, you're really, like, these things are important. That's also at times okay. But in general, falling to pieces because your authentic self is like saying that it's time to fall to pieces, that is not okay. Also, oversharing about what's going on in your personal life, that is not okay. And even like having a bad day and being grumpy and they're being authentically grumpy, all of those things, I would just invite you to discard, right? Because people don't want you to be authentic. They want you to be authentic in quotation marks. They want you to be the authenticity that they sort of envision in their head that a leader should be. So, first of all, it's helpful for you to get a vision of what you think a leader should be. And then, second of all, it is true that people follow vulnerability. People are loyal to vulnerability. So, finding these appropriate moments to show your chinks in the armor, that gives you a sense of humanity. And again, people can really be loyal to that. Also, people can see how they can contribute to you because of these little chinks in the armor. And that, again, brings loyalty, and it brings people that they want to work for you. So you've got to kind of amass the right, combination of behaviors that shows that you're in charge and you're the leader, and also that you're a human being. So that's why I switched from authenticity to humanity. I think authenticity has been vastly overused and now is one of those words that no longer means anything.
I agree with you. So it's that appropriate vulnerability at the appropriate times.
Right.
And that balance every leader is going to have to identify for him or herself. A lot of leaders too, when from a founder of a startup to the new leaders coming in, they always suffer, or they usually suffer to some extent, of imposter syndrome, right? That you've never run a company like this before. We're doing this for the first time. I've never managed this number of people before. I think everyone experiences it at some point or at multiple points in their career. What are some tips, tools, strategies that you have that really help people out in dealing with this?
Well, first of all, 95% of high achievers suffer from imposter syndrome, which, I read that recently and I'm like, wow, that's a lot of people. And and I would just say for myself, in the sanctity of the coaching room, I talk to men, women, famous people, not famous people, political figures, public figures about imposter syndrome all day long. So I'm very acquainted with imposter syndrome. To me, it's actually a marker that you are stretching yourself in a way which feels really significant. And so I want to encourage everyone to push themselves up to the limits of imposter syndrome. However, when it gets paralyzing, you need to find tools to unhook yourself. One tool, which my favorite tool that I prescribe to my clients all the time, is this notion of having a highlight reel. Basically, you're collecting evidence of your past successes, that you've been competent before and have had successes, that you have overcome difficult obstacles and challenges in the past. And if you think about those and then write them down and then look at them every day, it reminds you of your greatness. It reminds you that you're able to overcome challenges. So it's not like magical thinking. It's more like, I actually have evidence that I can count on myself. And that is the best way to overcome imposter syndrome, which is this notion that my luck is going to run out. Well, here's evidence that your luck is not going to run out.
No, I love that. And that's the one I use. The other one that I love that I haven't heard of before, but I think would be effective as well is to challenge your negative beliefs, is to picture yourself through the eyes of others. So if you could just kind of give us some more insight around that, because I think that's great, because you're going to look a lot more impressively to someone else than you are to yourself in most cases.
Absolutely. I have worked with a client who was having, just a lot of, I guess I would say, insecurity about managing people older than him. And he was going down this sort of trap of, I can't do it. A lot of CEOs think if I were a real CEO, I'd be able to do it, but I can't do it. I'm not a real CEO. And I asked him to look at himself through their eyes, right? So the older people who had never been a founder and had actually left big corporate jobs to come and work for him. And the fact that he'd raised, probably at this point, like $70 million. So I just asked him to analytically look at himself and describe what he saw. $70 million, right? Started a company from nothing, went through difficult times, now successful with all these seasoned executives coming to work for him. And I thought, does that sound like a real CEO to you? And he had to agree that it sounded like a real CEO. And then once you unhook yourself and tone down the voices in your head, then you can do the work you need to do.
Because the other big advice that you give around that, which sounds kind of trite, is positive self-talk, right? And everyone's heard of that, but I don't know if how many people really know the importance of it and how much you talk to yourself and how that can impact your behavior throughout the day.
Yeah, actually, research into elite athletic performance is the best way to look at this. And they have done a lot of studies, and what athletes say to themselves impacts their performance. So, negative self-talk actually brings down your performance. And first, I want to say that it's helpful to tune into the negative voices. It's not just like, oh, I'm good enough and smart enough and gosh darn people like me. It's not like that. It's first of all recognizing, oh my gosh, I'm telling myself all these things. And when you write them down or you identify them, you get a little distance from them. They no longer become this sort of amorphous, just part of the ecosystem inside of you. They become these very specific, tangible thoughts that you can maybe challenge, also that you can then work on. And also it just feels like it's not infinite. It's a couple of things. And so for all those reasons, it's super helpful to, first of all, identify what you're saying to yourself, forgive yourself, and then be clear on that. And then you could insert the things you should be saying to yourself and you would be saying to yourself, which are much more positive. The way to think about that is if one of your employees or a close friend were thinking these negative things about themselves, what would you want to say in response? What would you want to counteract with? Again, back to evidence. What evidence would you have that that's not true? And that's how to use positive self-talk in a rigorous way, not in a fluffy way.
Oh, that's great advice. And I love how you didn't include this piece of advice that I hear from leaders a lot with imposter syndrome. It's fake it until you make it. And they hear that and they say, okay, well, I just got to assume that I can do this. But without the proper preparation, if you take on a role that you're really not qualified to do, that can backfire, right? And it's not really an effective approach for this imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I would not want my surgeon to fake it until he makes it. Okay, that's first of all. I think it's a fine line because if you have an imposter syndrome, you always think you're faking it, right?
Right.
And at the same time, I think it's more about having faith in yourself to know when you need help and you need to study, ask other people, learn what you need to learn, and have the confidence in your ability to figure things out, which are in the range of figurable outable based on where you are now.
Well, that's great. So we've unpacked a lot with just managing yourself. Like to move now into the second part of the book, managing others. And I love for you to kind of identify for us the difference between leadership and management, right? Because they're not the same thing. And that distinction, I think, is critical for leaders when they come into managing others.
Yeah, I think I say in my book that holy wars are fought on the distinction, right? And the sort of the preference or the virtues of leadership versus management. And I would say that in general, leadership gets the privilege, oh, I'm not a good manager, but I'm a great leader. It's a good thing. But
Right.
actually, we need both in a company, right? You don't have to necessarily do both, but first of all, give like credence and props to the managers because they're the ones who are getting work done, who are helping their people, like helping their people break up the work into milestones, measurement, mentoring, coaching. All that work is the work of managers. Leadership is more about setting direction, it's more about setting overall intent, it's about motivating people. It's just that we need both of those hand in hand. And actually, it's super helpful for one person to be able to effortlessly morph back and forth into those two different arenas because more than one is needed.
And like you said before, it's about getting curious, right? Who are your people? What motivates them? What sets them off? It's really getting to know them and their behaviors because the better you know them, the more you can motivate them and guide them and activate them in the right ways.
It's so true. I was talking to a founder just the other day, a very well known and successful founder, and he said, honestly, management does not scale. You've got to get to know people in the trenches one on one, and you've got to figure out who that person is and how they need to be motivated and managed. Yes, you can create tools. Yes, you can create a playbook, but ultimately, it's about your relationship with that person that's going to be distinctive.
No, that's great. The other thing that I see with people moving into managing others is they're very short on the praise. And you state that praise should be your secret superpower because leaders, a lot of times, I know I'm guilty of this too. I hear probably 10 to 15 times the amount of negative feedback to every positive piece of feedback, right? And it's always nice to feel appreciated, which is different than being recognized. But how should they be showing more praise to their people? Is it in small ways, big ways? What's the frequency that you would recommend just as a ballpark figure?
Yeah. So, first of all, it's to make peace with the fact that you're probably not giving enough positive reinforcement and praise to your people. Accept that and then decide that you're going to make a change. The truth is, that's true for founders, entrepreneurs. It's also true for most leaders, certainly most CEOs. And the way to think so, I'm going to step back. People are motivated in part, a lot of people are motivated in part because of progress. They want to feel like they are making progress, that their work matters. And so, if that is true, you've got to show people that their work matters. I think that people get funny about praise because they say, well, I'm not going to just praise them for showing up on time,
Right.
which I'm like, well, I didn't actually ask you to do that. Right? Like, okay, don't do that. I don't know why everyone is so like against this. I'm not going to just praise them for just doing their job. However, when someone hands you a spreadsheet, like just hands you a spreadsheet or runs a meeting for you, and they did a good job, you're probably thinking, well, that was a good meeting or good spreadsheet, whatever it is you're thinking, but you may not be saying it to that person. And like literally, it costs you 30 seconds, not even, and zero money to just mention to them, good meeting or good spreadsheet. And I promise you, you'll get so much back from them in terms of motivation, in terms of discretionary effort. So all you have to do is kind of remind yourself to look for things to praise, to look for things to recognize, and to be positive in your outlook so that you are constantly pointing out what's working because inevitably you will come back and point out what's not working. So buy yourself the right. You got to earn the right to point out things that are not working, expect people to care and to be motivated to change them by making sure you're doing the positive affirmation as well.
No, that's great. And I would argue too that you should even do it first because I find myself when someone turns in a project, right? It's probably 80 to 90% good, but you still see those one or two things. And my default setting is to go to those one or two things first instead of saying, hey, great job. I love it. I'm so impressed. Can I ask you just one question? And I get so much better interaction with them if I do it that way than to say, okay, they spent 3 days or a couple weeks or a couple months on this. And oh, by the way, this and this and this isn't right.
Yes, I myself am guilty of that. And then when it happens to me, I'm annoyed. Right? I'm working on a keynote right now and I'm just noticing and I asked my good friend to rehearse it with me. So I rehearsed it with him and he immediately went into what was wrong with it and the flaws and the problems. And at the end, I thought he didn't like it and I was going to have to change it. And at the end, he said, oh, that was really good content. I was like, oh, you liked it? Right. And so it's just so funny how it's even easy for me, and I'm a coach, to criticize and to point out the flaws, but you notice when it happens to you that you don't like it. So again, I come back to what you said earlier, which is empathy, and what I said, which is there's another person over there. Try to remember that, and that's going to help guide you as well.
Well, and you get so much more out of the person. I can't agree with you more when you praise them for what is working than just immediately go to the negative. It builds their confidence. It makes them feel appreciated. And I don't know of any employee who says they're just too appreciated in their job. So everyone
No.
could use appreciation. That's
Yes.
really difference. There's a different and there's a distinction there between recognition, right? Recognition, you're praising results, but you can appreciate your employees regardless of what they're producing if they're good employees each and every day to make them feel valued, cherished and loved and a valuable part of your team.
Yes, I love what you just said that. I also love that you just said love. And I think that sometimes people are uncomfortable praising because it feels like the workplace version of I love you. And somehow that's like uncomfortable. But what's wrong with you loving your employees in that way? And also, you can still have hard conversations. In fact, you're going to be much more likely if you showcase, I am your ally, I am on your side, I want the best for you, I think you're fantastic. You then earn the right to say, listen, I think you're fantastic, but I promise you, you are not going to get ahead if you keep doing this behavior or if you don't start doing this behavior, whatever it is. I wouldn't be wasting my breath if I didn't think you could make it and that you were fantastic. And when you've shown yourself as an ally, they're going to hear that a lot more readily.
Yeah, the feedback you give them, they're going to be much more receptive to it. I can't agree with you more. And getting to what you just stated too is when you have those difficult conversations or when they make a mistake. I like the debrief conversation recipe that you have in your book, the GOD, the goal, the outcome, and the do-over. Because a lot of times when you go into it, you're almost assassinating their character, I like to say. So they can't do anything about that. You're not contextualizing it to make sure that it's just about that problem, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. Either just about that problem or just about that process. Or like when you come in and you're, first of all, to your point about character assassination, first of all, it feels very negative. Second of all, it's definitely not in the realm of like, here's, an analytical way to think about it. And that's what I think is helpful about a process, a GOD process to debrief. It forces you to get analytical and step by step. And then again, they can digest it in a different way and also gives them agency. What's the do over? Like the do over is very helpful because that's where learning happens.
No, you're absolutely right. And the other big thing that I hear a lot regarding managing others is accountability, right? And there's a wrong way and a right way to think about accountability. I'd love for you to differentiate those two and give our leaders a little bit of insight into what's the right way to think about it.
Well, I think the wrong way is blame, right? You jerk. And also your fault. And also, I'm going to give you a D minus, right? Grading, right? This is not helpful. Accountability, I think, is a lot more. And also, another thing that happens is that I'll say, well, to any leaders, how are you thinking about holding him accountable? And they'll say, well, I'm not going to fire him over it. Again, I didn't say you should fire him. Okay, I'm wondering where that came from. And so it's really about people not knowing the tools of accountability. Sometimes the tools of accountability are just, hey, I noticed. I just want you to know, you told me you're going to have the thing on Wednesday. It's now Friday. You don't have the thing. I noticed. Why don't we talk about how we keep commitments to each other? And also, I think accountability has to be like it really gets supported by an environment of psychological safety so that we can say anything there is to say to each other and still feel safe. So then when we talk about accountability, people don't immediately feel blamed and feel defensive. But they can have a little conversation about, interesting, I did make that commitment, but I didn't write it down. I didn't take it seriously. That's again managing yourself, right? It's like you're asking them to manage themselves, or even, I didn't think you really cared about it. So I didn't bother letting you know it was going to be late or whatever it may be. But that's the right conversation to be having because that's the underlying dynamic that's going on inside of your organization.
And I would argue before you can really hold people accountable or really deal with this is you have to establish that trust, that psychological safety, right? You have to get
Definitely.
to know your employees and they have to feel that you have their back. Otherwise, it's going to be a blame game. And I can't agree with you more.
Definitely.
The phrase you use, which I love, and I haven't heard this elsewhere, but I love this in the book because it puts the proper perspective for any leader, a senior level leader, CEO, founder, is there's problems everywhere. And you just have to accept this reality, right? There really are problems everywhere. When you solve these problems, guess what? New ones happen tomorrow, and that's the game. The good news, which I think a lot of leaders discount to some extent, which they shouldn't, because they can just go work for another company and they're going to see the other side of this, is that you get to choose your problems, which is a nice thing to have, even though you are going to continually have them, right? You aren't going to get away from them. So So it's just having that mindset, I think really puts things in the perspective that it needs to happen. And for founders, especially when they're saying, well, why did I start this? The founder's journey is so fraught with difficulties, with issues, but realizing that I think helps out a great deal in terms of their mindset.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I totally agree, of course. And when I say problems, problems everywhere, I try to take the bite out of like,
Right.
like what's happening around here? Yep, that's the startup journey. And I totally would say, I say to all my founders, picking these problems, you don't like these problems, go someplace else and find a different set of problems. But ultimately, for all of us, power is being able to choose our own problems.
Absolutely. Can't agree with you more. So with that, the other issue that I've seen with managing others, and it's kind of a down, it's not a very happy subject, but it's terminating or getting rid of employees. And I've heard this from other leaders to say that a lot of times leaders get it wrong, right? It's too quick to hire someone. It's too long to fire someone. It should be the opposite. And when you think that you should be firing someone, it's probably already too late. So what is some advice? What is a script? What is an approach that you can give leaders, maybe a tip, just to help them to identify this and to help them through that process? Because it's never easy, especially when they're a new leader and they might be doing it for the first time.
Totally. When you hire your people, you have a contract as a leader. And so the contract it's sort of two elements of the contract. One is that we're going to keep you here. We're going to give you opportunities. We're going to pay you. We're going to give you these benefits. And your job is to do your job, right? So that's like contract number one. The second contract is I'm going to create an environment for you where you can thrive, where we have high achievers, where everyone's doing their job, whatever. When someone is shirking, when someone is not getting the job done either because they can't or they won't or whatever it is, you are violating your contract to the rest of the employees. You just are, and everyone knows it. And so be aware that you're sort of being soft on folks and not wanting to deal with these issues is causing an impact that you do not necessarily see. So you're privileging your own comfort over really the contract and commitment you've made to everybody else around you. So in light of that, the first thing to think about is, again, I start with positive feedback, like you're doing a good job, positive feedback. Here are the things that are working well. And you want to earn the right with people to then have a difficult conversation with them, which is your attitude is great. You're working great with the rest of the team, but I don't see you hitting your goals. And on the one hand, the collaboration is super important. And on the other hand, the goals are what are going to get us to where we need to be. So I'd love to hear from you what you're going to do to make these changes in order to hit your goals. And right, that's like a conversation you need to have with people. And they come back to you, they don't come back to you. But over time, they're not hitting their goals. So now you need to have a conversation, which looks like, hey, as we talked about, I need you to hit your goals. It's been a few quarters now, and I've asked you to do this, and it hasn't been happening. I've been trying to support you. I've also been looking at your plans. I've asked you to go get help, support, mentorship, self-study, whatever it is. I haven't seen you do that. I need you to know that if you don't make these changes within the next month or so, we're probably going to have to part ways. I don't want to do that. I really believe in you. However, that is what I have to do is best for you and the best for the company. When they then come back to you and they haven't achieved what you asked them to achieve, then there should not be a surprise when you reference the past number of conversations you've had and indicate you now have to part ways. And I think it's the sort of waiting, and the surprise that's a real problem for people and super toxic. And when you keep waiting, everyone else is noticing that you're not taking action.
Right. It lessens the morale of your team. And I read one study where you add a superstar to your team and productivity increases 20 to 30%. You get rid of someone that's toxic on your team and it skyrockets twice that amount. So it's so important to deal with these proactively. And no, there's no way to do it painlessly. Don't pretend that it's not going to be that, right? You have to make peace with it before you do it. You have an obligation to the company, like you stated. And on the bright side, which I love how you stated, it's liberating to do this, right?
Yeah, it's always liberating. It is. It's for liberating for you because you don't have it hanging over your head anymore. It's liberating for the team, to your point, because performance around you gets unlocked.
Yep. Couldn't agree with you more. Final topic I wanted just to touch upon is delegating. A lot of issues around delegating. When a leader comes in, a founder comes in, they just assume that they have to do everything. And they either have this perfectionism mindset or they just feel like they need to micromanage everyone. What is that right balance? And what are some tips maybe to help leaders to be more effective delegators?
Well, the right balance is that, first of all, you really want to assess the will and skill, which is that the framework, the Blanchard framework of situational leadership about this person that you're delegating to. So don't delegate a very senior, complex, nuanced task to someone who's kind of new, and don't micromanage, right? Or you can don't delegate junior things to senior people, but if you do, that's when you realize that you could give them a lot of leeway and just, let them go figure it out. But a more junior person needs a lot more attention from you and guidance from you. So make the assessment of the complexity of the assignment to the level of skill of the person you're delegating with, and then recognize that you're going to get it wrong many times, because you're going to zoom in when you should zoom out, and you're going to zoom out when you should zoom in. So then you have to sort of be course correcting all the time, and you learn as you go about the makeup of this person and their natural strengths and weaknesses. And that's how you begin to calibrate better the delegation to this person. But it's very difficult. I just want to say that very senior leaders regularly get delegation wrong. And I think that for me, one tool I would give everybody is to really be clear about what done looks like. So I'm delegating somebody to you, and we both agree this is what the final product should look like. That way, at least I know that we had that agreement, and then you can go figure out how to do it yourself.
That's great advice. I found some questions that you give in the book that are very helpful as well. What's the highest and best use for you as a founder or a leader? What's the thing that most needs to get done that only you can do? Because you have to identify those MITs, those most important tasks. You have to spend time in deep work. Otherwise, you can get mired in the weeds and you lose focus. And your company is depending on you to set that strategic vision and to move forward in the future confidently. But you can't do so if you can't see through the forest, right? If you're just lost in all of the details.
Totally. You'll never, ever be able to scale if you keep doing everything the same. By the way, you'll never be able to do scale if you keep doing what you've always been doing. So you've got to grow. You've got to find your highest and best use. And that's going to change every 6 months, every year, every 18 months. And you've got to be willing to make the changes alongside the changes of what's needed from you.
And that goes to what you really said at the beginning of the book regarding a lot of people come into this role and they really don't know what a CEO actually does and the important parts of it. They thought they were going to do what they really like to do. Now they're doing stuff they don't even want to do. So it really makes them an ineffective leader. Can you kind of talk about that distinction that really leaders need to understand before they accept that role?
Yeah, I mean, if you love product management and product development and visioning new products, and then you put yourself in the role of being the CEO, the truth is that when your company is successful, that is not going to be you tinkering with the product anymore. That's just not. If you like the technology and thinking about the architecture and you become the CEO, that is not going to be you planning the architecture for the future. And that's sad. And that you have to sort of make peace with that. So, like, it may very well be easy to give away the task of budgeting, or it may be easy to give away the task of like sales, but ultimately you, the CEO, don't get to do anything directly. So you've got to make peace with that in order to make peace with the fact that you're building a company.
I love that distinction. That's so important. As we reach the end of this episode, I always like to end it with a call to action. So, Alyssa, is there one thing that leaders can do, a tip that you can give them about managing themselves, and maybe another tip about managing others? Start on that
Sure.
process.
So many things. I mean, there are so many tips. I'm going to give you two for managing yourself. It would be really helpful if you would write down what you know your superpowers are and what you know that you need to build, right? Your weaknesses or development opportunities, and really think about how you're going to manage around some weaknesses or development opportunities. And then also how you're going to use your strengths and your superpowers in order to activate your highest and best use and to stop doing things you don't want to do. The second is everybody should find a good routine that helps them be their best. I like fitness. I think everyone should be including fitness. Also, some sort of relaxation. Also, some sort of commitment to the sort of your emotional well-being and your mental well-being. It's very important to have those self-care practices.
Great tips and advice. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. Greatly enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Alyssa, tell our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Oh, please get in contact me. First of all, my book is right here, From Startup to Grown Up.
Great book.
And you can come to my website, alisacohn.com, ALISACOHN.com. and you can go to /startup. You can also download my 5 scripts to help you have delicate conversations or difficult conversations. alisacohn.com//scripts. And you can also find me on LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram or all the socials.
Thank you, Alyssa. I love those scripts. Use them myself. I recommend that for everyone, especially getting a copy of that book. This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this episode with your colleagues, friends, or anyone else who might have found this, or you might think might find this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found on both Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.